Welcome to Women of the World, a show which gives a voice to women from around the world who have chosen to make the United States their home. Our show believes in the principles written on and enshrined by the Statue of Liberty. Here's today's moderator, Elder Samarit Strawn.
Hello, I am Elder Samarit Strawn, and it is my pleasure to be your moderator for today's episode. To my far left is my first co-host, Ann McKenna. Ann, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I really look forward to today's discussions.
Yes. And right next to me is Nadia Jordana.
I'm glad to be here today. It's hot and sunny outside, but it's still fun to be here.
Yes, we love the heat. And all three of us are thrilled to welcome our guest, Dianne Determan, an award-winning author of a trilogy of novels set in the context of Japanese American lives in, during and after World War II. Dianne, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our time together.
So to begin with, I'm just so excited to delve right in. The subject of prejudice against a particular group of people can be so painful and difficult. I am wondering how you got into creating the context or even the desire to pen your novels.
Well, actually, the books are inspired by a Japanese family that lived across the street from me in Minneapolis when I was a child. And both those parents had been imprisoned in camps, but I didn't know that at the time. And I was best friends with their daughter, Donna, and I walked her to school in North Minneapolis when I was a little girl. I was 7 and she was 5. And I didn't know then, but I found out later in life that her parents had both been imprisoned in camps. And I thought I didn't know anything about it. Because in high school in the 60s, when I went through school, I read nothing in my history books about the internment camps. So it was a really big subject and a personal subject for me. So I started researching that period of time, and that's where the books kind of came from.
So you spent your early years with this family, going to school, knowing the family, and not knowing about the history during World War II now. So that was what, several years after the war? Yeah.
Yeah, probably early 1950s.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And then growing up with a little girl and not feeling a sense of what that family went through.
Not at all. And they were a very wonderful family. The Art Matsura would mow our lawn when we were gone, and he was just so helpful. And I didn't see any racial difference between myself and Donna. And then his wife was a musician, talented musician. So they were just wonderful neighbors, and we got along really well. So I just didn't understand what all the negativity was in post-World War II America toward that family.
So what was it like for you to go through the process of investigation and studying and finding out all the facts how did that impact you?
That's an excellent question, because that was one of the biggest challenges for me, because I knew nothing about the Japanese internment camps. So I actually started reading a lot of different books about them. I talked to Donna. I Facebooked her at different times, and she'd give me feedback about what it was like for her parents. And then I just did 3 years of research on that first book, Courageous Footsteps. Mm-hmm. And if I didn't know something, I went and researched it and looked and compared different sources, so I was sure that I pretty much had the information. But it was a challenge for me, and the more I read about it, the more I was driven to finish the book, to write the book, because I just felt it was a story of the past that has so much relevance today.
Dianne, what is your own cultural, ethnic background?
My grandparents came from Finland.
Wow.
In the early 1900s, and they settled in Barris, Minnesota and raised 7 children during the Great Depression. And they just carved a life out of a very rough part of our state, and we're just determined with what the Finnish people call sisu. Sisu meaning determination, perseverance, keeping going, in spite of any of your hardships.
And you wrote a memoir about that, didn't you?
Yes, I did. And it's called Miriam, Daughter of Finnish Immigrants. And it's about these are my great-grandparents on the cover. And the book actually started in a class at Hamlin University in my graduate program. And I interviewed my Aunt Miriam. It's her story and her point of view about growing up embarrassed and attending a 2-room school. And the little seed of the book started there, and eventually we published the book in 1995, and then I had it reprinted in 2008 because we had sold all the copies out. So that's how it all started back here.
A 2-room school. I didn't even know they had 2-room schools.
Exactly. My current husband had a 1-room school that he went to out in the country in Wisconsin, and he was really impressed with that idea. It was a 2-room school.
So I'm glad you wrote the history of your own family, and there was some controversy about a person, for example, of Finnish ancestry, who's writing about a story about people of a different ancestry, namely the Japanese. So you did a lot of research, and how did it feel emotionally to be telling another people's story?
You know, in some ways it fit really well with the experience my grandparents had in terms of finding work here when they came. And so there were similarities, but there were also differences because my grandparents settled in an area where there were all pretty much Finnish people. So they spoke the Finnish language, they ate a lot of the similar foods, whereas the family across the street from me, they were basically surrounded by all people, Caucasian people. They were the only people of color in that neighborhood back in the 1950s.
For them it was more immersion instead of having a community of their own people and culture around them.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
But the stories go even deeper than just being surrounded by a community of people different than they were, the Japanese. There is this whole, I can only say, shameful story of what was done to them during World War II. So what do you think you learned from that whole story, the story of what they went through, but what was the change in you about how we treat each other?
Well, the first thing that jumps right up for me are the injustices they faced and the humiliation they faced in terms of their culture is a culture of being proud of yourselves and doing good things. And so when they removed so many of these people from the West Coast, and the camps are really, a lot of people think they were just on the West Coast in California, but they were all the way from California to Arkansas. Wow. So Art, the man next door to our neighbor, he was interned in California and his wife was in Arkansas, and then they reunited after the war. So it broke families apart in a lot of ways, it broke friendships apart, and a lot of the people, when they returned to their homes and their businesses, there was nothing there for them. And that's what brought Art to Minneapolis, was there wasn't any place to rebuild. So a lot of the churches, the Lutheran churches especially, sponsored some of those internees to come to Minnesota.
Were their properties seized also?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure some didn't get them back, but did very many get their property or their businesses back or not?
It depended, because a lot of the businesses definitely were taken over. Housing was a little different. Some of the people were able to get a neighbor to watch their home and their possessions while they were gone. In Courageous Footsteps, it talks about them selling everything before they could leave. And they had very little notice that they were going to be interned. It was just all of a sudden, a few months after FDR signed 9066, which was the order for them to be taken to the camps and imprisoned. So they had no time to really plan what to take or what to leave. And they were given 2 small canvas bags to put whatever they could carry to the camps. So
I have a question. So in your writing, do you have like a main theme? What is it that you hope to achieve with the writing that you are doing?
a lot of it for me is the awareness of our differences, but also the awareness of our similarities as human beings, what we need to survive on this earth together and to live productive, healthy, happy lives. Mm-hmm. And I just think of how hard my grandparents worked and how difficult it was for so many of these Japanese people to rebuild their lives and that type of thing. So yes.
And this trilogy of yours is a 3-book series. It's, I would call it historical fiction.
Right, exactly.
So it's an interesting fictional story with which you did the research for, but a lot can be learned out of historical fiction, along with enjoying an exciting and interesting story.
Absolutely.
I did have a similar question. She's like, you're going and you're doing all of this research, and again, I'm struck with how emotionally impactful what you were researching really is. It was awful what you were discovering, and awful that you had never been taught about that in school.
That's right.
And then what is the process between you're learning all of these facts and between that and creating the story, creating a fictional story with characters and everything?
It was a balancing act between trying to, at first I thought, oh, well, I'm going to start fiction instead of start fiction instead of nonfiction. And then I thought, I can just make it up. But you can't. With historical fiction, it has to be true to the time. So I did a lot of research on the culture, the foods back then, different kind of language, slang that they used back in the 1940s. And it took me back to that era, which was really kind of fun to be submerged in that sense of time and what people did for livings and how different it is from that was a big awareness for me, how different it was for them back then and myself growing up there in Minneapolis and compared to now. Mm-hmm. It was just it seemed a lot simpler life.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What was the most unexpected outcome of you writing these 3 books?
Well, I would have to say that it would be the readers' feedback who read the books and gave me the feedback and how much they enjoyed the books for one thing, but how much they learned from reading the books. And the other part is I'm able to share the books at different book events, which I have done numerous book events with all 3 of the books, and reading parts of it to an audience. And I actually did present at a Finnish organization, and I shared the 3 novels at the Finnish organization, and they just were so taken aback with all the information, and they were really amazed and they saw similarities to their own parents and grandparents' experiences as Finnish people leaving Finland and coming here. Mm-hmm. So every group I meet with, you get a little different reaction and that type of thing, but it's fun sharing the story and seeing their ahas or their opening of their eyes to a new way of looking at things. So.
That's great. So, I mean, as an author on a personal level, tell us a little bit about the writing process, the authoring, the publishing, and how do you take care of yourself amidst all that work that you're doing?
That is an excellent question. And I am very, very blessed that I have a husband who is extremely patient. And I spend almost all day in my office from 8 o'clock in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. We take a break at lunchtime. And he's totally supportive. And my first husband, who passed away in 2000 at the age of 54, was also extremely positive and helpful, and gave me a lot of security with the writing. And I wrote a book about the fact I lost my husband, and it's called 28 Snow Angels, and I have a copy with me. And it's about the death of my husband, but now I'm using the book to do outreach at grief groups at different organizations throughout the Twin Cities here. So the books have a power, writing a book has a powerful experience to impact lives positively and sometimes negatively. But the process for me for writing is I just sit down at by my laptop. A lot of times I'll write longhand first. Because for me, I grew up writing longhand. That's the way we wrote. We didn't have all these fancy gadgets. So, so I start out longhand, but then once I get about 3 or 4 pages, then I can type it into the laptop, and then it kind of moves a little faster for me. So, but it keeps me very busy.
So how do you care for yourself?
I'm fortunate. I'm twice blessed in my life. Both my husbands loved cooking and grocery shopping. So my current husband, Alan, he does almost all the cooking. I do baking. As I said before, I love cookies. Yeah. And so it kind of makes it easier for me. And so we try to take care of ourselves, get my rest. I walk 3 to 5 miles a day. It's a way for me to process my writing that's sitting up in my head, and I carry a notebook, a little tablet with me as I write in case something hits me, so I can integrate it into what I'm working on. So.
And so what advice would you give to others or people that are hoping to write? You know, some people want to write and they never get to it. What are some of the wisdom that you can give?
Well, the first thing I would say is start as young as you can. Get started, get that base. I just did a 2-day conference with a young writing group up in Stillwater this past week. And that's what I told them to. Start early and just write every single day. Even if you're not working on a project, I start my days with writing in a notebook, just journaling thoughts and kind of getting myself going. And then I do the same thing at night before I go to bed.
How young were you when you started?
I loved writing since I was 5 years old. The first memory I have of writing is sitting on the porch steps at our house in North Minneapolis, scribbling on a little tablet, just wiggles, squiggles. They weren't even really words, and then I'd read them to my friends. So I've always enjoyed it, and then in college, when I was in my graduate program at Hamlin, that really sparked my writing. I was in a Her Story class, all about women in history. And so we had a couple projects, and that's kind of where Miriam's book came from, was that conversation I had with her in that class, and that was a thing that's...
What kind of things did you write early on?
Early on, I've done poetry. That was a big piece for me when I moved to Afton, Minnesota, where I live now. And it's so beautiful out there. I'd take photographs, and then I'd write poems to go with those pictures and put them in a notebook. And then I was a contributing author for Women's Voices for Change for several years, and I'd submit articles to them. So different organizations have really supported me, and it really is exciting to see your work.
Diane, when did you know that writing would be your work, your career, or your work, however you think about it?
Well, I actually started as an elementary school teacher. I taught in the St. Paul Public Schools for my whole career. And the last 6 years, after my first husband passed away, I took a job as a literacy coach at a school, Bruce Vento Elementary in St. Paul. And my task was to train teachers in the areas of reading skills and writing skills for the students. So I did a lot of, I went to workshops all across the country getting information and getting trained, and then I'd come back and train the teachers. So that was a big part for me, and the students loved writing. I'd go into a classroom, and with even like first and second graders, they'd sit on the floor in front of me, and we'd be talking about writing, and then they'd go back to their desk, and they were just so involved and loved it, absolutely loved it. And I'd always say, make sure it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so a lot of times the little first graders would always sign it, the end. So it was a really enjoyable time for me, and it was a good thing for me to be doing because I was all alone. John had recently passed away, and it was a stretch for me, but I'm glad I took that stretch.
Was it only after your husband's death then that you began to publish your books, and so like it became more the way you define perhaps yourself?
Yes, in a lot of ways. I actually wrote in notebooks all the time, you know, and I go back to those notebooks, and there's some really sad parts in those notebooks, and the writing is really scribbly, like I've been crying, you know, whatever. But a lot of those notebooks had seeds that went into that book, 28 Snow Angels. And so it's just a process. You just find what works best for you, and you just kind of work through it. And then those notebooks had bits and pieces I could use in the book, and just write it bigger, of course, and more detailed. So yeah, it's a.
So in working with grief, so you are doing grief groups and helping people cope with that. Do you find a connection with the racism that you've written about with the whole Japanese? Is there a loss in that, and do you find connection, and how do you use that writing, the grieving that people go through with discrimination, the grief with loss? Is there a connection? Do you find a connecting point in that?
Yeah, indirectly I do, definitely. And grief is something that we all experience in some shape or form. And I think especially when you're in a situation of culture, different cultures, and that type of thing, losing your identity, no matter how you lose it, is a big part of a grieving situation. And you have to reconfigurate yourself, possibly, type of thing. You have to give up some things you don't want to give up. And that's kind of the way I felt with John when he passed away. It was like, my life has now changed, totally changed. And I have to find another way to cope with it and make it better for myself. And so it was a very dark time for me, actually, and I can see where anybody losing something, whether it's related to their race or their family or their own personal identity type of thing, I think that would be really, really difficult.
Fiction is such a complex process, Diane. How close do you feel to the characters that are in the trilogy about the Japanese-American family? And how close do you feel to them, even though they were a product of your imagination?
I feel very close to them. And in some ways, while I was writing the book, Haro, who is the oldest son in the family, takes on the character of my older brother. Because I took a lot of the feelings and the activities and the experiences I had with my brother Tom as an older brother, and kind of integrated that into that character. And then Yasu, who was the sister, that's kind of like me. It's kind of the kind of experience I had during the time I was growing up with my older brother, the conflicts we had with each other, the arguments, and how we got along periodically, and different things we did. And you just and the characters, when you first start writing, it takes a while to really identify with them. But the more you work with them, the more you almost feel like you're in their body, and and you're thinking like that, and them, and acting like them. And a lot of your own personal experience comes into that story. And because it's fiction, you can put part of that in there. It can't be all about you, but you can't help but not integrate whatever your schema is or your background knowledge, because it'll come into play anyway. So.
It'll sneak out.
Yes, it does. It definitely does. Yeah.
Wow. Have you shared the books with your original friend, the one who lived across the street, and how did that impact your relationship with her?
That's a very good question. Donna was left Minneapolis shortly after. She was about 7 years old when they left and went back to California. And so eventually we lost touch, and I wasn't sure where she even was, but I found her on Facebook, believe it or not, and we reconnected. And so she shared a lot of her background as far as what it was like, you know, in her family and this and that, and our relationship with each other. And she was willing to read book some of the chapters prior to it going to publication, because I wanted her to let me know if it was on point, if it's true, if it was something that was credible. And so she did. She read just a few chapters out of Courageous Footsteps, and she got back to me. She said, Diane, this is right on where it needs to be. And then she actually, I offered to send her a book, but she said, when it got published, she said, we want to buy one.
How
So,
validating.
so I autographed one and mailed it to her, and so she bought a copy of all three.
You never did get to interview her parents, though, for them.
No, and you know what? I tried visiting with Art, her father. I was out in California at a writers' conference, and I took a taxi cab and went to visit him. And at that time, he was in his late 80s. And so I started asking him questions, and he was very, kind of soft-spoken, and just, it was a part of their life, I think, they just kind of wanted to let go of, and they really didn't share that much of it. So, but Donna was really good about reading the background knowledge and giving me some insights into that. So, and Art actually lived to be 99.
Wow.
And he was just the sweetest man, just so sweet. It was it was the relationship that I've had since I was a child, and I am still connected with them. I actually dedicated Courageous Footsteps to him and his family. So.
Beautiful. One last question about your writing. 24 or 28 rather, Snow Angels,
Yes.
captivating title. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's a very good question too. You have so many good questions. The 28 is the number of years John and I were married. We met at the Rusty Nail in Brooklyn Park, and then it was about a year later we got married, and we were just hooked at the hips, and we just loved being together. So that's where the 28 comes from, the number of years we were married. Then when he passed away, it was devastating. It was actually, it would be 19 years tomorrow that I lost him. Wow. And he died at 3 in the morning. I tried to get him back, and it was just, I couldn't get him back. So, so the first New Year's Eve, we used to go out with a group of friends, and everybody had their special person with them, and they asked me to join them, and I just couldn't do it by myself. I can't do it. So instead, I decided to go out in the yard. The snow was on the ground, and there was stars in the sky, and so I went out there to make 28 snow angels, one for every year we were married. And I laid down the snow, and I spread out my legs and arms, and I only got to about 18 because it was so cold and so I was tired. So that's where the Snow Angels comes from. So.
And we have run out of time. It's been such an incredible, heart-opening learning experience talking with you. Thank you so much for being with us on our show. Thank you, Ann McKenna. Thank you, Nadia. And that's our episode for today. We'll see you next time. Thank you for watching.